The tension in the room was undeniable as reporters gathered, cameras rolling, and anticipation building. This wasn't just another routine press conference. This was a showdown. The energy shifted the moment the doors swung open and Karoline Leavitt walked in with the confidence of a seasoned warrior entering the battlefield. Every journalist in the room straightened in their seat, lenses focused, pens poised, sensing that something explosive was about to unfold. As she approached the podium, Leavitt took a brief moment to scan the room, her sharp gaze locking onto the expectant faces before her. The murmurs faded, and the room fell into complete silence. She adjusted the microphone with a steady hand, her presence alone commanding the full attention of the press corps. Then, with a razor-sharp tone, she delivered her opening salvo. "Let's get one thing straight. What you're about to hear today will expose the biggest lie in Washington." A heavy pause followed, a calculated move that heightened the suspense. Reporters exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued, the weight of her words settling over the room. Viewers at home leaned in closer to their screens, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. Leavitt didn't flinch. She had the press right where she wanted them. For weeks, Ilhan Omar and the Democrats have been pushing a dangerous, reckless narrative. They claim to fight for justice, but today I will prove to you that the truth is very different. The statement sent an immediate ripple through the room. A voice quickly cut through the thick tension. A CNN reporter, known for their aggressive questioning, seized the moment. "Karoline, are you saying Ilhan Omar has been lying?" All eyes turned to Leavitt, but she remained completely composed. A slow, knowing smirk crossed her face before she leaned forward, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Not just lying, deceiving millions of Americans." A gasp rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, camera flashes illuminated the podium, and in the back of the room, Ilhan Omar sat stone-faced, gripping the table. She knew what was coming. She just didn't know how bad it would be. The room was thick with anticipation as Karoline Leavitt's accusation echoed through the press conference. Reporters exchanged hurried glances, some scribbling furiously while others waited for Ilhan Omar's response. In the back of the room, Omar remained still, her posture rigid, her fingers tapping against the table in a slow, measured rhythm. She knew she had to respond, but she also knew that any misstep could turn this into a full-blown disaster. A reporter in the front row finally broke the silence. "Karoline, if you're accusing Ilhan Omar and the Democrats of deception, where's your proof?" Leavitt didn't hesitate. With the confidence of someone who had anticipated this exact question, she reached down, picked up a thick folder, and held it up for the cameras. "Oh, I thought you'd never ask," she said, her voice laced with a subtle smirk. The room stirred. Even the most skeptical reporters leaned in slightly, their curiosity piqued. Across from her, Omar crossed her arms, shaking her head dismissively. "This is absurd," she scoffed. "More Republican fear-mongering, more conspiracy theories. The American people deserve better." Leavitt turned to her, her expression unwavering. "Oh, we agree on one thing, Ilhan," she said coolly. "The American people do deserve better. Better than the misinformation you've been feeding them." The words landed like a hammer, and the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Reporters whispered among themselves, some flipping through notes, others exchanging glances. Sensing that the press conference had just escalated into something far more serious, the CNN reporter pressed again. "Then let's hear it, Karoline. What's in that folder?" Leavitt flipped it open. "Let's start with your own words, Ilhan, shall we?" She pulled out a printed statement and read aloud. "You recently said, and I quote, 'There is no real crisis here. It's all manufactured outrage.'" She turned toward the press. "Tell me, how is it manufactured when crime is rising, when illegal crossings have doubled, when American families are suffering because of reckless policies?" Omar leaned forward, her jaw tightening. "That's a gross misrepresentation of what I said." Leavitt didn't miss a beat. "Really? Then let's talk about what you didn't say, because silence can be just as telling." Omar's expression darkened. The cameras zoomed in. The tension was suffocating. Leavitt flipped to another page. "When violent protests erupted, when small businesses were burned to the ground, when innocent people were hurt, you refused to condemn it. Why?" Omar scoffed, shaking her head. "That is not true." Leavitt raised an eyebrow. "Then say it now, right here, right now. Condemn the violence." The room went silent. All eyes were on Omar. The camera zoomed in closer. She didn't respond. Leavitt smirked. That's what I thought. The tension in the room thickened as Karoline Leavitt's challenge hung in the air, her demand clear and direct: condemn the violence. The cameras zoomed in on Ilhan Omar, capturing every flicker of hesitation in her expression. Reporters leaned forward, waiting for her response, but none came. Omar's jaw tightened, her fingers tapping against the table in a measured rhythm, as if calculating her next move. Leavitt didn't back down. Your silence speaks volumes, Ilhan, she said, her tone razor-sharp. When innocent businesses were destroyed, when communities were torn apart by rioters, when law-abiding citizens lived in fear, where was your condemnation? Where was your leadership? Omar let out a slow breath, shaking her head. This is nothing more than Republican fear-mongering, she countered, her voice measured but lacking its usual authority. You are taking my words and twisting them to fit your divisive narrative. Leavitt smirked. Am I? Then say it now. Say that burning down small businesses, looting, and violent riots are unacceptable. The room went deathly quiet. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing Omar's reluctance to give a direct answer. She exhaled sharply. I have always supported peaceful protest, she finally said. Leavitt immediately cut in. But have you ever condemned the violence? Because refusing to denounce it is the same as endorsing it. Omar crossed her arms, shaking her head in frustration. I refuse to play into this game, she snapped. Leavitt leaned in slightly, her voice steady. It's not a game, Ilhan. It's accountability. Karoline Leavitt wasted no time shifting the conversation to another critical issue: the economy and public safety. With her folder still open, she lifted another document and looked directly at Omar. Let's talk about the real consequences of your policies. Democrat-led cities are experiencing record-high crime rates. Businesses are shutting down. Families can't afford groceries. And yet, you stand here and call that progress? Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zooming in on Omar, who exhaled sharply, already preparing a counterattack. That is a gross oversimplification, and you know it, Omar retorted, her tone clipped. Crime is a complex issue with multiple factors, and blaming it on one party is misleading. Leavitt smirked, flipping through her papers. Not that complex, she shot back. You enforce the law, you hold criminals accountable, and you don't prioritize politics over public safety. Omar's frustration grew visible, her hands clenching the table. And what about corruption in your party, Karoline? What about tax breaks for billionaires while working families struggle? The reporters perked up at the shift in topic. This was turning into a full-scale debate, but Leavitt was ready. You're right, Ilhan. Let's talk about accountability. That's exactly what we're doing right now. The tension in the room was electric. Leavitt leaned forward. You claim to fight for struggling families, yet you voted against tax relief for the middle class. You've supported reckless spending that's driven inflation through the roof. So tell me, how exactly have your policies helped the American people? Omar shook her head, her patience wearing thin. Because those bills were never designed to help working families. They were filled with loopholes to benefit the wealthy and corporate elites. Leavitt raised an eyebrow. And yet, those same corporate elites are among your biggest donors. So which is it, Ilhan? Are you fighting for the people, or are you just playing politics? Omar's jaw tightened, but she didn't immediately respond. The cameras caught it. Leavitt had landed another blow. Karoline Leavitt saw the hesitation in Ilhan Omar's face and pounced on the opportunity. She flipped to another page in her folder and held it up for the cameras. Let's talk about the people funding your campaign, Ilhan. You love to attack corporate greed and foreign influence in politics, yet your own campaign finance records tell a different story. The room stirred. Reporters leaned in, sensing that the press conference had just taken another dramatic turn. Omar immediately shook her head, her expression hardening. Every donation to my campaign is legal and publicly disclosed. Leavitt smirked. Publicly disclosed? Sure, but what about ethically disclosed? She placed the document on the podium. Because, according to this report, some of your largest donors have direct ties to lobbying groups that, let's just say, have a very interesting track record. The cameras zoomed in on Omar, her lips pressing together. This is nothing more than a smear campaign. She exhaled sharply. Republicans do the same thing. Should we talk about dark money fueling your party? Leavitt shrugged. By all means. If there's corruption, expose it. But right now we're talking about your donors. So tell us, why are these groups pouring money into your campaign? Omar hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. The energy in the room shifted. Reporters, even those usually aligned with Omar, started jotting down notes. Leavitt had drawn blood. The silence dragged on and Leavitt leaned forward. No answer? Interesting. Omar's frustration was now impossible to hide. This entire press conference is a joke, she snapped. Leavitt smiled, sensing victory. You're free to leave, Ilhan, but walking away won't change the facts. Omar's fists clenched. I'm not going anywhere. Leavitt gestured to the reporters. Good, because I'm just getting started. Karoline Leavitt wasted no time moving on to one of the most controversial moments in Ilhan Omar's political career. Flipping to another page in her folder, she took a deep breath before reading aloud. You once said, and I quote, "Some people did something" when referring to 9/11. The entire room went dead silent. Even the most skeptical reporters knew this was a dangerous question. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch of Omar's expression. Omar exhaled slowly, shaking her head. That comment has been deliberately misrepresented by bad faith actors like yourself, Karoline. Her voice was measured, but there was a clear strain underneath. Leavitt nodded. Right, so let's clarify it. What exactly did you mean? Omar's lips parted, but no words came out. Leavitt pressed further. Was it just something, or was it a terrorist attack that killed nearly 3,000 innocent Americans? Omar shifted slightly in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. I don't need to explain myself to someone twisting my words. Leavitt raised a brow. So, you refuse to clarify? Omar crossed her arms. I refuse to play into a dishonest narrative. Leavitt leaned forward, her voice steady. You mean a narrative where we hold public officials accountable for what they say? Omar scoffed, looking toward the reporters for support, but even some of them were waiting for a clear answer that never came. Leavitt let the silence hang for a few more seconds before speaking. You can deflect all you want, Ilhan, but the American people see exactly what's happening here. Omar's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she looked like she wanted this press conference to end. Karoline Leavitt saw the shift in the room. The reporters weren't just listening anymore, they were analyzing. Omar had stumbled, and now was the time to push further. Leavitt flipped to the next section in her folder and held up a document. Let's talk about something that truly matters to the American people. Your voting record. Omar inhaled sharply, bracing for what was coming next. Leavitt's smirk didn't waver as she spoke. You claim to fight for working-class Americans, but your record tells a different story. She lifted a printed sheet and read aloud. You voted against tax relief for middle-class families. You voted against tougher penalties for violent criminals. You even voted against a bill that would protect small businesses from over-regulation. The reporters stirred, flipping through their own notes to verify. Omar exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Because those bills were written by Republicans, who had no intention of actually helping the people they claimed to represent. Leavitt raised an eyebrow. So, let me get this straight. You didn't vote against them because they were bad for Americans. You voted against them because Republicans introduced them? Omar's jaw tightened. That's not what I said. Leavitt's expression remained cool. Then explain it. Why block tax relief? Why make it harder for small businesses to survive? Omar scoffed. Because those bills were filled with loopholes and giveaways to corporations. Leavitt nodded, then turned toward the cameras. And yet, the very corporations you claim to oppose are among your top donors. Gasps rippled through the room. Omar opened her mouth to respond, but Leavitt was already flipping to another document. Let's talk about the people funding your campaign. The same big money interests you supposedly fight against. Omar exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous, Leavitt smiled. What's ridiculous is the hypocrisy. The voters deserve to know who you really serve. Ilhan Omar's frustration was now impossible to hide. She could feel the shift in the room, the growing skepticism in the reporters' faces, the way the cameras focused on every pause, every hesitation. She needed to regain control, to redirect the conversation before it completely slipped from her grasp. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her posture and spoke, her voice laced with controlled defiance. "This entire spectacle is designed to put me in a bad light," she said, shaking her head. Instead of focusing on real issues like health care, education, and economic justice, Republicans manufacture distractions to avoid accountability for their own failures. Leavitt, unfazed, simply leaned on the podium. "You know what's interesting, Ilhan? Every time I bring up your voting record, your donors, or your past statements, your first instinct isn't to explain, it's to attack the messenger." The reporters glanced at one another, sensing the dynamic of the room shifting again. Omar could feel it too. She needed to counterpunch, but each time she tried, Leavitt had a response ready. A journalist in the back took advantage of the moment, standing up. "Congresswoman Omar, do you deny that some of your largest donors include corporations you have publicly criticized?" Omar clenched the edge of the table. "I have never taken money that influenced my policies. My record speaks for itself." Leavitt smirked. "Exactly. And your record shows that you vote against the very people you claim to defend." Omar exhaled sharply. The room was slipping away from her, and she knew it. Ilhan Omar's grip on the table tightened, her frustration barely concealed. She had faced tough debates before, but this was different. The cameras, the reporters, the piercing gaze of Karoline Leavitt. Everything was closing in. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. The room was no longer on her side, and every attempt to redirect the conversation had failed. The questions kept coming, and no matter how she answered, Leavitt was waiting with another damning piece of evidence, another sharp rebuttal that further exposed the contradictions in Omar's stance. Leavitt glanced at the clock, her smirk widening slightly. "I could do this all day," she said, her tone almost amused. "But I think we both know you're out of time." The remark landed like a final blow, and the tension in the room became suffocating. Omar exhaled sharply, glancing toward her aides, who were already preparing to cut the press conference short. The damage had been done. She knew that staying any longer would only make it worse. A reporter shouted one last question. "Congresswoman Omar, do you have any final response to these accusations?" Omar pushed back her chair, standing tall in a last attempt to appear composed. "This entire event was a political stunt," she declared. "I will not entertain baseless smears." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. The cameras followed her retreat. Reporters murmured, some exchanging knowing glances. Leavitt simply watched, arms crossed, victorious. A journalist turned to Leavitt. "Karoline, do you think today proves Ilhan Omar is unfit for office?" Leavitt tilted her head, pausing for effect. "I think today proves one thing. When faced with real accountability, Democrats panic." Within minutes of the press conference ending, the internet exploded. Clips of Omar's hesitation, her frustrated deflections, and Leavitt's relentless questioning flooded social media. Leavitt's "Destroys Omar" and "Omar Exposed" began trending as both conservative and mainstream media rushed to cover the fallout. News networks played the exchanges on repeat, breaking down every moment where Omar stumbled, and every instance where Leavitt seized control. The contrast was undeniable. Omar's attempts to shift the narrative had backfired spectacularly, while Leavitt's composure and preparedness had turned her into a rising political force overnight. On conservative outlets, pundits hailed Leavitt's performance as a defining moment in exposing hypocrisy and lack of accountability in the Democratic Party. She didn't just hold Omar accountable, she dismantled her, point by point. Meanwhile, more neutral or left-leaning networks were left scrambling to spin the story in Omar's favor, some dismissing the press conference as a political stunt. However, even among typically friendly media, there was no denying that Omar had struggled to defend herself. Public perception had shifted. For many voters watching, it wasn't just about the facts. It was about presence, control, and who appeared more capable. Omar's retreat wasn't just seen as an exit. it was seen as surrender. And in Washington, where perception shapes power, this was a devastating blow. The damage was done, and Leavitt had just cemented herself as a force to be reckoned with. The fallout from the press conference was more than just a political spectacle. It was a lesson in accountability versus evasion. Karoline Leavitt had walked into the room prepared, armed with facts and unafraid to ask direct questions. Ilhan Omar, on the other hand, had deflected, avoided, and ultimately retreated. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the fundamental expectation that elected officials should answer for their actions, their words, and their records. When faced with scrutiny, do they stand firm or do they crumble? For many watching, this wasn't just about Republican versus Democrat. It was about who was willing to be held accountable and who wasn't. Voters saw a stark contrast. One politician standing her ground, pressing for transparency, and another dodging and dismissing the concerns of the people she was elected to represent. The message was clear. Leaders should not fear tough questions. In a time when trust in politicians is at an all-time low, moments like these resonate far beyond the headlines. People don't just listen to what politicians say, they watch how they say it. Omar's reluctance to engage directly, her visible frustration, and her ultimate retreat left a lasting impression. In Washington, perception shapes power, and perception had shifted dramatically. The press conference may have ended, but the real debate about transparency, accountability, and political responsibility had only just begun. In today's fast-moving world where information spreads rapidly, accountability and integrity have become more important than ever. One of the biggest lessons from this political exchange is the importance of standing firm in one's beliefs, while also being open to scrutiny. Whether in politics, business, or everyday life, how we handle criticism and tough questions defines our character. Do we face them with honesty and confidence, or do we evade and deflect? This is something people of all generations, especially older adults who have seen decades of leadership and societal change, can appreciate. As we grow older, we gain wisdom through experience. We have seen leaders rise and fall, promises made and broken, and policies that either improve lives or create hardship. What remains constant is that true leadership is not about avoiding responsibility, but about taking ownership of one's actions. Just as in this debate, where one figure stood prepared and the other tried to dodge difficult conversations, we see this pattern in many aspects of life. A responsible individual, whether a leader or an everyday citizen, should not shy away from accountability. This lesson applies beyond politics. In families, workplaces, and communities, trust is built on honesty and the willingness to address difficult issues. Parents and grandparents teach this to younger generations, that responsibility is not about blaming others but about standing up for what is right. If someone makes a mistake, it is not the mistake itself that defines them, but how they respond. Do they acknowledge it and work to correct it, or do they make excuses and shift blame? Another takeaway is the power of preparation. Life often presents unexpected challenges, and those who are prepared, who do their homework, who think critically, and who anticipate obstacles are the ones who thrive. We have seen this in history, in leadership, and even in personal life. When we are informed and confident in what we know, we can stand our ground without fear. Finally, this situation highlights the importance of active engagement and awareness. Many older adults have witnessed political and societal shifts firsthand and understand the value of staying informed. It is easy to let emotions drive opinions, but facts and rational discussion should always be the foundation of our beliefs. Critical thinking, knowing how to separate truth from manipulation, is a skill that everyone, young and old, must continue to cultivate. At the heart of it all, this is about integrity, leadership, and personal responsibility. Whether in politics, at work, in family discussions, or in personal decisions, the way we handle scrutiny defines who we are. The lesson is clear. When faced with challenges, do not run, do not deflect. Stand firm, speak the truth, and be accountable. That is the mark of true character.